So let's get straight into it. I finally got to see the Saturday Night Live movie. It was dubbed SNL 1975 for a little bit and was renamed Saturday Night because that was the original name of the show. I had wanted to see it, and it's kind of impeccable timing here. I saw it on Netflix, didn't get to see it in theaters. Honestly, I felt like I blinked and it was out of theaters. It felt like it didn't have that much of a punch when it came to box offices. But finally, went to go see this movie. This movie kind of documents and chronicles the first episode of Saturday Night Live, which debuted in October 11th, 1975. And this movie takes you from the first 90 minutes, the 90 minutes before the first live shot of SNL, and it takes you through what the pre-production was like right before they went live to America on their first episode. And it is a pressure cooker of a movie. If you're watching something, I feel like a lot of times the complaint in movies itself is that there is not enough of a hook to get you into the movie, or that it takes too long to get into it. If you've ever watched a movie like pre-1972, there's like 10 minutes of credits before you even get to anything in the movie. This one does not have this problem. You are immediately thrown into a situation where it's 90 minutes before SNL goes live, and you're following Lorne Michaels basically putting out fires left and right up to the second that the show goes live. And there are moments there are funny moments, there are tense moments, you really feel like you're just a fly on the wall in this experience, just following him everywhere you go. Lorne Michaels is played by Gabrielle LaBelle, and Rachel Sennett also plays Rosie Schuster, who's Lorne Michaels' wife. You get a little bit of insight into how he's putting together this show that no one really has faith in at the time, which is a funny thing to think about 50 years later, especially on the heels of them celebrating the 50th anniversary on February 16th. So just a little bit more than a week away that they're going to have their big extravaganza. So it is hard to kind of put yourself in a scenario where SNL is not really a cultural thing at this point, right? That it's completely full of question marks. It is a held together by a Swiss cheese of a plan, and everybody has their doubts. There are people on the cast and production that express openly about why they're even doing a show like this. It is very, very interesting to watch. Especially since SNL has permeated so much of the culture that I can't remember. I mean, SNL was long when I was born. It was long established, right? So it is funny to put yourself in the shoes of an NBC executive looking at the show going, this is completely a zoo. And how is this thing really going to replace what they had on NBC before? And if you don't know a little bit of the history of SNL kind of came about because there was a weekend opening on NBC in 1975. And you got to think, like, that's prime real estate compared to the fracture and split of all the television channels today and the streaming services, right? There's so many different ways now you can get your entertainment. But in 1975, you got 3 channels still, right? Like, you got 3 channels that are still at the king of the hill, right? Johnny Carson, they used to run Johnny Carson reruns in that spot until they basically told Lorne Michaels to develop a show, and that will kind of be in that place, right? And when you get brought into this picture, when you watch this movie, it certainly puts you immediately in the emotional disposition of, hey, this show is not going to work. It is this is not going to be a healthy show. This is not a healthy work environment in a lot of different ways, right? It definitely puts you into that time frame and basically makes you the viewer, the producer and showrunner of Saturday Night Live, and in that way, it is fantastic. I honestly watched it straight from beginning to end. It's a very short, concise movie, which you gotta love these days because a lot of these movies tend to be 3 hours long, right? They're commitments at this point. But this one, from the beginning to end, it does not lose tempo. The other thing that I noticed right off the bat is that there is a camera technique that is used in a lot of really interesting films to kind of exemplify stress and or exemplify people juggling different different tasks. They used it also in Pulp Fiction, where the camera follows the main character for a long, long time. And immediately my feeling was that the orchestration of that not only is really impressive in its own right and gives you an idea of what Studio H is kind of built like at the time, or Studio 8H is built like at the time, it also kind of makes you feel like you're in a live production by doing that, right? So much of Saturday Night Live feels like a theater piece in front of you because it is. It's a live play, right? It's a live comedy review. By them taking you through with one shot with very minimal cuts, it stops becoming cinematic and gives it that live environment right off the bat. So you feel like you're in it, right? This is something that Pulp Fiction did with John Travolta and Samuel L. Jackson, and it's a very, very famous, like 8-minute long tracking scene. But this one immediately throws you into the environment, and also does a great job of introducing different characters during this one long tracking shot in the beginning, and gets you into the movie right away. I thought that was really, really impressive. The funny thing about this movie too is that coming on the 50th anniversary, it does make you think about the evolution of the show, right? We talked about earlier about how that this environment seems like it's a highly dysfunctional environment, right? You have a whole bunch of comedians, you have a whole bunch of musicians thrown into this pressure cooker and trying to hit marks. You have cameramen, production people, and it reminds you just of like how a play gets produced, right? I was in college plays and when I went to a university, and like it does feel that way when it starts to become Hell Week and dress rehearsals and costumes and stuff like that. It does feel like it's just one thing after another, right? But when you see how they're putting together a show, and they make mentions in the movie about how they have like over 3 hours of content, and you start wondering like, was that the goal? And then you start realizing that they have to kind of cut things. But it wasn't uncommon for even the Tonight Show to be more than an hour long in the early days of the Tonight Show. But when you go back and watch that first episode of SNL, you start realizing how different SNL has become from what it was originally pitched as, right? It made me go back, and I kind of wish I actually watched the first episode and then watched the movie. It's been the only movie where I wanted to go back and see how they dramatized these moments, because I was not familiar with how the first episode of SNL was. I knew George Carlin was in it. I didn't realize how much George Carlin was in it, how many times they shot to George Carlin. They had 2 comedians on. They had 2 musical acts, including Billy Preston. There were 4 songs. There was a Muppet play in the middle of it from Jim Henson with it. That was a really weird, opaque sketch. Um, and it was funny how experimental it seemed. Even 50 years later, it still feels like you're watching some sort of avant-garde play in Greenwich Village somewhere. And I think that's funny because a lot of times when you go back and watch something that's 50 years old, right? There are very few things that kind of hold up in terms of comedy, right? Think about the Johnny Carson show, right? The Johnny Carson show was great in its time, right? Still, Tonight Show still exists today, right? But you can't go back to some of those old monologues that he did because unless you have a completely sharp contextual knowledge of what's happening at that moment, at that week, some of those jokes will just fly over your head, right? Some of the jokes still work today, 50 years later, right? There are some pieces that fall flat, right? But you can still watch it and it's still entertaining, right? They still had nuggets of pure entertainment with the musical acts, right? Some of the sketches are not like, groundbreaking. They're very short. Very, very short was another opinion that I had watching that first episode. It's fascinating the movie is fascinating because it does make you want to go back and watch that first episode for sure and just see how it evolves over time and what decisions are made to kind of get it to this current incarnation of SNL that we know today, right? I'm sure it takes years, right, for it to really find the formula that seems to have worked for now years. But it is interesting how much of it still actually plays 50 years later. And it's kind of humorous just to see some sketches where you're like, not quite sure if this is a sketch or not quite sure if this was just not funny at the time, or if it's just completely lost to because of the contextual relevance isn't there anymore. So I would recommend if you're going to watch this movie, watch the first episode and then watch how they dramatize these things. Like look at the comparisons between the actors playing George Carlin, Andy Kaufman, Billy Preston, John Baptiste from the Colbert Show plays Billy Preston in this movie. One of the criticisms though I had of this movie watching it, right, and there weren't many. I was actually kind of surprised that the movie was not more praised, right, for its energy, for its pace, right, how fast it was, is the payoff is kind of missing at the end, right? They tell you what the movie is from the very beginning, right? It is the 90 minutes leading up to the first episode of SNL. And when you get to the showtime, you want the show to start, right? Because you've seen all the pain and the suffering and the tears, the blood, the sweat, right, that goes into making a production like this. So the payoff does feel like it's just not there. It's hanging when you leave. But like I said before, it does make you go back. And I went to Peacock immediately, looked at that first episode, and so clearly it stirred something in me. I was like, I need to see this. So I thought that was really, really, really interesting. It's also kind of it's funny. The actors do such a good job. I mean, there's actors that played Chevy Chase, Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi. They're excellent in this movie. The actor who plays Dick Ebersol, the NBC executive who was most famous for NBC Sports and was involved in the fiasco with The Tonight Show back in 2010, they bring not only accuracy to the roles, but Dick Ebersol's role brings dramatic tension to Lorne Michaels, right? Which you don't think is going to happen, but he's in a constant fight with NBC executives about the actual success of the show, which is, again, kind of fascinating to watch because we know from 50 years later, we know that the success of this show permeates culture in so many different ways, and for so many different generations, right? Like everybody, this is a conversation that has been had many, many times, but everybody has their cast, right, of SNL that they related to, right? My cast of, Tina Fey, Will Ferrell, Jimmy Fallon, those guys, right? But other people have, Adam Sandler, Rob Schneider, and those crew, Chris Rock, Phil Hartman, and Dana Carvey, and all those different people. Everyone has their sketches that they remember. And everybody seems to have a sketch that permeates the culture. And it feels like every 5 years, it's almost like an election cycle, right? Every 5 years, there seems to be a sketch that kind of breaks through the fourth wall and you can't get away from, right? I mean, 2 weeks ago, it was the Espresso Domingo sketch, right? But I remember incarnations of sketches like, Van Down by the River, right, is still like considered a viral video. The cowbell video with Will Ferrell, right? Tina Fey's, Sarah Palin, right? Every election cycle, it seems like SNL kind of comes to the fore, right? And they have they're reviving and reviving and reviving, right? And they're evolving and they're evolving and they're evolving. It's a fascinating show, right? I would be interested in seeing movies that kind of went into different eras, right, of SNL. I think they did this movie perfectly because they did what some other movies that are trying to depict real events don't do, right? A lot of biopics about people's lives, right, will take their entire life and try to slam it into an hour and a half. What this movie does really well is that it takes an hour and a half and takes you through that hour and a half. They pinpointed the most exciting moment of SNL was the moment before the red light went on and that they went live for the first time. That origin story is most exciting in the lead up to it, right? They took us inside the zoo. They took us inside the circus that was happening in 30 Rock and gave us a sneak peek into the insanity that made up the foundation for a show that was going to live 50 years on, right? Do I think that, this movie is clearly for the 50th anniversary of SNL. I think it's perfectly timed. I think Jason Reitman, who is the director of this movie, did a great job as a companion piece to all the stuff that's going to happen come next week with SNL. I would love to see different versions of this with different casts, right? I would love to see actors have a take on Adam Sandler. I would love to see an actor do a Dana Carvey, right? Like this is the Chevy Chase, Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi, those characters doing such a good job mimicking them. The guy who plays Billy Crystal is really impressive, right? You don't really realize how good of an impression of Billy Crystal that is until you're watching this movie. It made me want to see other moments in time from SNL. Maybe like that moment of time when SNL changes hands, right, and is a completely new cast, like when it's Robert Downey Jr.'s in it, right? I'd love to see a movie that depicts like SNL during during the pandemic or something like that, like something that's very, very specific to SNL's history, right? I think could still be kind of expanded. So unfortunately, do I think that they're going to expand on this story? No, I think it's just a companion piece, but I would love to see different little windows of time using the same format because it was exciting. It was energy filled and the pace was fantastic. Let me just check my notes really quickly. So February 16th is going to be the SNL 50th anniversary. So before you do that, check out they have a free episode on Peacock for the first episode of SNL. I would implore you to just keep watching. The second episode starring Paul Simon is fantastic, going back to like how different the show was. I mean, Paul Simon on the second episode starts the show off with like 3 songs, record perfect. It's an amazing display of talent. So go check out those old episodes and watch this movie Saturday Night, which is on Netflix. Again, directed by Jason Reitman. It's a great movie, a great piece to watch. With that, we are going to take a little bit of a 5-minute break. I'm going to get a little bit of water, and we will come back talking a little bit about Brian Cashman's comments on Gleyber Torres coming up next on this live episode of the Powell Not Found podcast. That's what you're listening to right now. Let's take a quick break.